The boy Frank suddenly heard a scream coming from his mother's room. He quickly turned around, only to see that his father, who had just been full of joy moments ago, was now frowning and pacing back and forth. Sensing a trace of unease, he immediately got up and walked into the room, only to find that his newborn baby sister, less than a day old, had suddenly passed away. What Frank never expected even more was that his father, who was deeply addicted to alcohol, actually left the house at that moment and did not return for many days. The young Frank had no choice but to take his younger second brother and together look after the two younger twin brothers, as well as their mother who lay weak in bed. But how could two children who could barely take care of themselves possibly shoulder the heavy burden of supporting an entire family? With no other option, Frank had to take his second brother and knock on the neighbor's door. Fortunately, the female neighbor was kind-hearted. She not only cooked food for them but also personally helped Frank take care of his bedridden mother. But just at that moment, the landlord who came to collect the rent suddenly appeared, looking at the messy house in complete disarray, and then at the sickly mother lying in bed, along with the four pitiful children. The landlord who had intended to demand rent could not bring herself to speak. She told Frank's mother that she would waive the previous rent, but they had to move out within 1 month. Hearing this news, Frank fell into complete despair. Fortunately, 3 weeks later, his father finally returned home. The family of 6 packed their few belongings and moved out of the rented house, as the family of 6 had already fallen into desperate circumstances and could not even afford train tickets. The father had no choice but to take Frank to the telegraph office to ask Frank's grandmother for help. Although the father was irresponsible and drank heavily all year round, Frank still deeply loved his father. Along the way, the father and son chatted and laughed. Happiness filled Frank's heart, and this became one of the few beautiful memories of his childhood. With the grandmother's help, Frank's family finally got on a bus, then transferred to a train, and after a long and bumpy journey, they finally returned to their mother's hometown. But it was clear that the grandmother's family did not like the father who was idle all day and constantly drunk. Because the grandmother's house was very small, she helped Frank's family find a new rental place. Although the grandmother's life was also very difficult, she still paid 3 months' rent for them and even left them 1 month of living expenses. The rental house was very small with only 1 bed, so the family of 6 had no choice but to squeeze together onto that single bed. But the environment there was very unsanitary. The bed was infested with fleas, and before long, the 2 youngest twin brothers were bitten until they burst into loud cries. And so, in the middle of the night, the whole family began their battle to drive away the fleas. But soon, 1 month was about to pass. The living expenses given by the grandmother were almost gone, and the harsh winter was approaching. The father took Frank out to buy coal, but as winter was drawing near, the price of coal had risen sharply, and unable to afford it, the father and son had no choice but to turn back home. On the way, they saw several people picking up coal, and the sensible Frank immediately bent down to join them, but he was sternly stopped by his father. The father told Frank that he would rather freeze to death than lose his dignity. The helpless mother, although she also had her dignity, still resolutely got up and took Frank and his second brother out to pick up coal. Because the family was poor, one of Frank's twin brothers had been running a fever for many days and did not receive timely and effective treatment, and his condition suddenly worsened. Although the mother and father realized the severity, they rushed desperately toward the hospital without hesitation. But in the end, the twin brothers still died on the way to the hospital. The mother held the deceased twin brother and lay on the bed without saying a word, remaining silent for a long time. Filled with grief, Frank and his second brother lay beside the bed, also silent. Because Frank's family was poor, they could not afford a coffin at all. After learning the news, a charity arranged the entire funeral for them. Watching his young brother being buried deep underground, Frank felt anger rising in his heart. When the funeral ended and everyone slowly left, Frank still stood in place, unwilling to leave for a long time. What he never expected was that the other twin brother also suddenly died one night under strange circumstances. With the family in poverty, the mother finally managed to apply for a small subsidy from the labor office to support the household, but the alcoholic father secretly took the subsidy and left home for many days without returning. In order to find his father and recover the money, Frank searched everywhere and finally found his father drinking happily, but he was still too late, as the subsidy had already been mostly spent by his father. To keep the family going, the mother had no choice but to put aside her dignity and take Frank and his brother to the labor office again. Trying to apply for some more assistance, she tearfully explained how the consecutive loss of her twin sons had deeply affected her. She carefully described the hardships of her current life, She even turned around to show the staff the holes in her clothes. In the end, after all her pleading, the staff only agreed to provide her with 1 table, 2 chairs, and 1 bed, and all of these items were second-hand furniture from unknown sources. As the entire country was in an economic depression at that time, life was difficult for everyone and various illnesses were spreading everywhere. The mother worried that the second-hand furniture might carry viruses that could endanger her 2 sons' health. But the staff said, to save money, the mother had no choice but to take Frank and his brother and move to a neighborhood even farther from the city center, because the rent there was much cheaper than before. Just as the family moved into the new house full of joy, they suddenly smelled a foul odor coming from outside the door. Frank's family originally thought the toilet in front of the house belonged exclusively to them, but a man told them it was a public toilet used by more than a dozen households in the neighborhood. The man also said they had better get used to the smell as soon as possible, because when summer came, even wearing a gas mask would not be enough to block the stench. After hearing this, the father could only helplessly close the door. Besides the door facing the toilet, Frank also discovered that their rented house was built on low ground, so whenever it rained, the house would quickly fill with standing water, and the water mixed with the smell from the toilet, filling the entire room. Frank's family lived like this for more than a year, until one day they had another new baby brother. Because of the newborn brother, the money originally intended to buy shoes for Frank and his second brother had to be used to raise the youngest child. But the soles of Frank and his brother's shoes were already worn beyond repair. With no other choice, the father found an old bicycle tire and used glue and nails to patch the soles. But the father was not a professional cobbler. Although he managed to cover the holes after much effort, the repair marks were obvious. The next day, when Frank and his brother went out wearing the repaired shoes, they were immediately mocked and ridiculed by many other children. With his self-esteem shattered, Frank could only tightly protect his younger brother and continue moving forward amid the laughter. In order to escape poverty, after much persuasion from the mother, the father, who had been idle all day, finally began to go out looking for work. But because the entire country was in economic decline, unemployment kept rising, and the father, who was used to a lazy life, was unwilling to endure hardship. So after many days of effort, he still failed to find a job, until one day 2 weeks later, with the grandmother's help, the father finally got a job. Early in the morning, the mother got up to polish the father's shoes, and then carefully dressed him from head to toe. At this moment, the mother was extremely happy, because she believed that her once idle husband had finally changed and that their life would get better and better. That evening, full of anticipation, the mother stood at the door with Frank waiting for the father to return from work. But in the end, after waiting outside for a long time, neither Frank nor his mother saw any sign of him. Only after a long while did the mother finally lower her head in disappointment. At that moment, she finally realized that her husband would never change. Until dawn, the father, drunk after a whole night of drinking, finally staggered back home, under the stimulation of alcohol. He even began to sing in excitement. Listening to his father's drunken singing, Frank's heart was filled with deep disappointment. Even as his father banged loudly on the door outside, the angry Frank refused to get up to open it and instead tightly covered his ears. The heartbroken mother also never opened the door for him. The father, in his dazed state, slept outside the door until morning. The next day, the father did not go to work and was therefore fired from the factory. Because of the family's hardship, Frank could only eat half-full meals every day, so he went with his friends to catch fish by the river, sometimes climbed trees to steal apples from others, or secretly milked other people's cows to satisfy his hunger. For this, he was often beaten by others. When the mother found out that Frank had been stealing outside, she was filled with sorrow, but she could not bear to blame the young Frank, because she knew he only stole because he was hungry. However, the mother did not want her son to become a thief. At this moment, the father finally realized what an incompetent father and failed husband he had been. He swore to his wife that he would turn over a new leaf, find a stable job, and never let his wife and children suffer again. Their conversation was clearly heard by Frank. From that moment on, the sensible Frank never stole from others again. Over the next 3 years, the father found many jobs one after another, but he was always fired because he could not endure hardship, frequently skipped work, and had various other problems. Until one day, another baby brother was born. The grandfather in the north, overjoyed to have another grandson, sent £5. Perhaps because of the joy of having a new son, the father could not resist the urge to go drinking again. Frank stood in front of his father and said that the £5 sent by their grandfather was meant to feed the new baby, and he must not use the money for drinking. But how could 2 children stop their tall father? Frank and his brother could only follow closely behind him, pleading desperately, but the father used his authority to order them to go home immediately. With no choice, Frank had to take his brother and angrily turn back home. When the mother learned that her husband had gone drinking again, she was filled with anger. She told Frank to go to the tavern, find his father, and stand in the middle to loudly expose that he was using money meant for feeding a baby to drink. The obedient Frank immediately left home to search for his father. Before long, he saw his father immersed in alcohol, drunkenly singing loudly. After thinking for a long time, Frank ultimately did not follow his mother's instructions to expose him, because at that moment, Frank still deeply loved his father. He did not want to destroy his father's image in front of others, and he wanted to preserve his father's last bit of dignity. With a heart full of melancholy and disappointment, Frank slowly walked back home. After returning, he told his mother that he had not found his father. This was the first time in his life that Frank lied to his mother, and also the only time. The boy never expected that his father, who was always drunk and idle, would actually decide to go out and work to support the family. Seeing the father suddenly become so determined, the whole family was filled with joy and immersed in hopeful expectations. At this time, Frank believed that his father had truly made up his mind to become a good husband and father. So every day, he sat at the door with his brother, waiting for the postman to arrive, because their mother told them that in just 2 weeks, their father would send back his first paycheck to improve their poor life. But after waiting for more than a month, they received neither money nor even a single letter to support the household. The mother waited every day at the back door of the church to ask for leftover food from others. When things became unbearable, she borrowed money from lenders to get by. All of this was seen clearly by the sensible Frank, so he decided to find a job to ease his mother's burden. After much pleading, he finally got a part-time job at a coal yard. From then on, as soon as school ended, Frank rushed to the coal yard. He carried coal sacks almost as heavy as his own body and delivered coal from house to house. Soon, he earned the first wages of his life. Filled with joy, he excitedly ran home to show his mother the result of his labor, but the coal dust soon damaged his eyes, and before long, they became red and inflamed. The mother could not bear to see Frank suffer and told him to give up the job, but the stubborn Frank refused to give up this hard-earned job. The mother could only try every day to clean and protect his eyes, but soon, Frank developed severe keratitis in both eyes. Sick, Frank had no choice but to give up his first job. A month later, with life becoming unbearable, the mother once again went to the labor office to apply for assistance. According to the rules, since the father was working away from home, Frank's family was not eligible for aid. Fortunately, the staff at the labor office knew somewhat about the father's alcoholism and unreliability, and so, amid the ridicule of others toward her husband, the mother received a small amount of assistance to sustain the family. One morning a few days later, the father, who had been away for more than 5 months, finally returned. Although he was a very unfit father, Frank and his brothers still joyfully threw themselves into his arms. But after nearly half a year of working away, the father did not bring back a single penny, and there was a wound on his right eye, clearly caused by a drunken fight. At this moment, the mother had completely lost faith in the man before her. The father tried every way to explain, saying that the country's economy was in decline and work was hard to find, so he had not earned much money. But Frank and his brothers directly exposed his lies. Listening to the children, the father seemed to realize something. A few days later, on Christmas Day, the mother unusually bought a sheep's head that no one else wanted, intending to celebrate the family's reunion. But the father did not eat a single bite. Instead, he stood up, packed his belongings, and resolved to go out and work to earn money. He told his wife and children that he would never let them down again. And so, on a day when everyone else was reunited with their families, the father resolutely turned and left home. The mother did not get up to see him off, but instead lit the first cigarette of her life. Only Frank chased after him to say goodbye, but the father and son walked one after the other in silence, without saying a single word. 2 weeks later, the father sent back £3 from afar. From then on, there was no more news, and he completely vanished from Frank's life without a trace. After that, Frank often stood at the place where he had said goodbye to his father, looking out again and again, but the empty alley never showed his father's figure again. In the blink of an eye, Frank had grown into a vibrant young man. As soon as he walked into the room, he found his 2 younger brothers tearing the house apart, and he immediately joined in. Their mother not only did not stop them, but sat nearby clapping and cheering with joy. They did this simply because they could not afford coal and had no way to cook or keep warm. Living in extreme poverty, they now had nothing left, and the only thing they had was this bittersweet moment of joy in tearing apart their own home. But their brief celebration did not last long, because they had already fallen far behind on rent. One morning a few days later, the landlord suddenly came to the house. Seeing that the original two-room home had been dismantled like this, the landlord was instantly furious. He shouted that not only had they failed to pay rent, but they had also destroyed his house. In the end, filled with anger, the landlord drove them out and gave them only 2 days to move. The helpless mother fell into deep despair. She had no money at all and still owed debts to lenders. As the 2-day deadline came to its final moment, with no other choice, she hurriedly left the house with her 4 sons, carrying their few belongings. Because they were driven out, their move looked like an escape. After that, Frank and his 3 brothers, led by their mother, squeezed into their grandmother's home for the time being. Although the grandmother's house was small and life there was also very difficult, she still took in Frank and his mother and brothers without hesitation. But not long after, the grandmother caught a cold that was not treated in time, which turned into pneumonia, and she eventually passed away. Only a few days after the grandmother's death, the aunt who inherited the property drove Frank's family out of the house. Frank and his brothers once again followed their mother to a distant cousin's home. To earn the right to stay there, the entire family became servants to this cousin. Every day, Frank had to empty chamber pots and clean the toilet, while the mother took on laundry, cooking, and all the household chores. But as time went on, the cousin was no longer satisfied with letting the mother do only simple chores. The mother had no choice but to use her own body in exchange for the right to continue staying there. Watching his mother enter the cousin's room whenever called, and hearing the sounds from upstairs, Frank's heart filled with grief and anger. But no matter how furious he was powerless to change anything. Until one day, Frank accidentally forgot to empty the chamber pot. Although he kept apologizing, the cousin still scolded him harshly. Seeing this, the mother hurried to defend her son, but was humiliated in return. Witnessing his mother being insulted, the anger that had been suppressed inside Frank finally erupted. When the cousin saw Frank shouting at him, he immediately rushed forward. The mother hurried over to try to stop them, but the conflict was unavoidable. Frank thought that standing up for his mother would earn her praise, but instead she scolded him for being immature. Then the mother went upstairs again and entered the cousin's room, begging for forgiveness. At that moment, Frank was filled with disappointment toward his mother, but how could he understand her painful choice? Everything the mother did was only to give Frank and his brothers a place to shelter from the storm. Unable to understand his mother's intentions, Frank finally left the cousin's house under the cover of night and began his journey alone. A woman was suddenly shocked by the scene before her. She had only intended to wake up her nephew Frank, who was still sleeping at noon, but instead discovered that he was wearing her dress. The sight in front of her instantly stunned the woman. Frank lowered his head in embarrassment. He hurriedly explained that he had found a job at the post office, but he only had one set of clothes, and it was already too dirty to wear. So he secretly opened his aunt's wardrobe and casually took a piece of clothing to change into. He did this only because he wanted to leave a clean and neat impression on his first day of work tomorrow. Frank had planned to change back into his own clothes before his aunt returned. But unexpectedly, before his washed clothes had dried, his aunt came back suddenly with his drunken uncle. With no other option, he hid under the blanket and pretended to still be asleep. But his aunt turned on the light and scolded him as she pulled off his blanket. Frank thought that he would be driven out again, because half a month earlier, when he came to rely on his uncle, he had promised to pay rent and living expenses every month, but he had not found a job and had been living there for free for half a month. And now he had even worn his aunt's clothes. Watching his aunt storm out of the room, Frank knew he was about to become homeless. But what he did not expect was that in the evening, his aunt suddenly took him to a clothing store. She not only bought him new clothes and new shoes, but even gave him some pocket money. He was instantly confused, unable to understand why his aunt, who had always been so calculating and obsessed with money, suddenly showed him such care. In fact, everything the aunt did was just to ensure that Frank could keep working at the post office, so that she could collect rent and living expenses from him every month. Even so, Frank was still moved by her actions. He gave his aunt a kiss. This was the first time in his life that he felt this once stingy aunt was not so unpleasant. Soon after, Frank began his work at the post office. Every day he rushed tirelessly from place to place, just to deliver the mail to its recipients as quickly as possible. He had thought that this life of delivering mail would continue unchanged. But one day, because the road was slippery from the rain, he suddenly slipped and fell. Enduring the pain, Frank slowly got up and then knocked on the recipient's door. The one who opened the door was a girl about his age. youthful and beautiful. Seeing how disheveled Frank looked, the girl offered to apply medicine and clean his wounds. Standing at the door, Frank hesitated for 3 seconds before finally stepping inside. But what he never expected was that after treating his wounds, the girl suddenly pushed him onto the sofa. At the height of youth, Frank could not resist such bold advances, and he instantly gave in. After that, Frank often went to the girl's house to secretly meet her, and the two fell deeply in love. But what Frank did not know was that the girl was actually suffering from severe tuberculosis. People with this illness needed rest and had to avoid intense activity. Yet unaware of this, Frank repeatedly knocked on her door to meet her again and again, until one day, when he knocked on the door once more, it was the maid who answered. From the maid, he learned that the girl, already seriously ill, had worsened and had been rushed to the hospital 2 days earlier. Hearing this, Frank felt as if his beautiful world had completely collapsed. He immediately rode his bicycle toward the hospital. He kept blaming himself, believing that it was his constant visits that had worsened her condition. As he pedaled with all his strength, he loudly reproached himself in regret. He prayed to God for a chance to atone, begging for the girl's recovery. If his wish could be granted, he was willing to leave her and never come near her again. Standing at a distance, watching people hold the girl's funeral, Frank fell into deep thought. Even the strong-willed boy finally shed tears of pain and regret. He believed that he had caused her death and was tightly gripped by overwhelming guilt. And the boy who had never drunk alcohol before finally drank himself into a stupor for the first time. He staggered through the streets at night, singing loudly without restraint, looking just like his father who used to drink all day. After being away from home for many days, under the numbing effect of alcohol, he unknowingly returned to his mother's side, because deep in his subconscious, his mother was his only emotional support. Seeing the once sensible Frank now drunk, the mother was reminded of her unreliable husband. She scolded Frank, saying he should not drink so much and should not become like his father, drunk every day. But in his drunken state, Frank spoke without restraint, saying that although his father loved drinking, he had never been involved with other women. "And you," he said, "have an improper relationship with my cousin." The angry mother did not want to argue further and stood up to leave, but Frank would not stop, venting all the anger he had long suppressed. The mother covered her ears tightly, but Frank did not stop, continuing to insult her without restraint. This confrontation between mother and son became unavoidable. After sobering up, Frank was filled with regret. He did not understand why he had become like his father, drunk and out of control, the very image he had hated as a child. He regretted saying so many hurtful words to his mother. He regretted even more that he had raised his hand against her, but he did not have the courage to return and apologize in person, until one morning a week later, his mother suddenly appeared before him. At the sight of her, Frank immediately lowered his head in silence, still unsure how to face her. After a long silence, he finally looked up, gathered his courage, and personally apologized, begging for her forgiveness. Then tears of guilt and shame streamed down his face. But what Frank did not know was that as a mother, she would never truly blame her son. Frank lay in his mother's arms, crying like a child. A few days later, one afternoon while delivering mail, Frank unexpectedly encountered an elderly woman. The old woman lived alone without children, surviving by lending money using the wealth left by her husband. After learning that Frank was literate and wrote well, she hired him part-time to write threatening letters to those who owed her money. For just a letter of a little over 100 words, she paid Frank 3 pence. To keep this well-paying job, Frank carefully revised his writing again and again every day, trying to make it perfect. One day, even Frank's own mother received a threatening letter written by him. Seeing this, Frank fell into deep silence. He had planned to rely on this job to improve his family's life. But one day, when he arrived at the old woman's house as usual, he discovered that she had died alone at home. In order to help his mother escape poverty, Frank took all the cash from her house and also took her account book. The account book recorded all the debts she had issued. After reading it, Frank realized that nearly half the city had borrowed money from her. His mother, his aunt, and even that hateful cousin all had their names in the book. Frank threw the thick account book into the rushing river, erasing the debts of all the poor. Afterward, he sent all the money he had taken to his mother. Knowing that he had committed a crime, Frank bought a ticket to America and left the country where he had lived for many years. After that, he wrote a book based on his own experiences, which became a bestseller, and he eventually became a widely renowned writer. I am a movie enthusiast, and I look forward to our next encounter.